Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm ffinlo Costain. The Food, Farming and Countryside Commission has unveiled research which shows that the British public reject nanny state excuses and instead overwhelmingly back state intervention to tackle our health, climate and nature crises. Dr. Courtney Scott is the Director of Policy and Research at the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. I asked her whether politicians are more interested in the so-called nanny state than citizens.
It's interesting. We started exploring through food this relationship with health, with farming, with land use, climate, nature, trade, justice. And when you start exploring these issues with citizens, a kind of common question comes up, which is who holds the power to make change? And citizens really recognize that they have some power as their role, as consumers and citizens and community leaders, but that the power to really lead meaningful change quite often sits with others, and mostly that's with government and with business, because they feel that this system, the food system, is so big, it's so interconnected, that actually we need leadership at quite a high level. And as a result of that, participants and citizens, people we spoke to, and this was reflected in nationwide polling as well, kind of overwhelmingly rejected this idea of a quote unquote nanny state. And that they want kind of government intervention in the food system, especially in the context of wanting a sort of fairer, greener, healthier kind of outcome for them as individuals and for them and their families. And this was strongly supported by polling data as well, which showed that most citizens want the government to take action. So 75% of the public think that the government's not doing enough to ensure we all have enough healthy food. 78% think there should be tighter regulations against certain types of industrial farming that are harming nature in the countryside. So I would say for food in particular, it's been a really interesting way in to explore how people feel about kind of government intervention in this system.
Courtney, you mentioned one or two there, but what are the key issues on which the public want to see state-led intervention as opposed to intervention from, for example, food businesses?
So this is only the start of this conversation. So we've done kind of 2 proof of concept sites, and we've had nationwide polling, but there's already strong agreement on certain policy areas. And this comes down a lot to the kind of idea that citizens want government and businesses to take the hard decisions that put people and planet first. So that includes things like restrictions on junk food advertising, higher standards in catering and for schools and hospitals, things like support for farmers to farm more sustainably. And that was right across, all sectors of farming, going beyond existing policies with more investment, more incentives to do the right things. On the flip side, also taxes and regulations to hold kind of big food businesses to account, such as adopting a polluter pays model for environmental harm, but also for the production of unhealthy foods. So it was really interesting to see citizens take up that idea of polluter pays and saying, hey, it shouldn't just be for environmental, externalities and pollution, but also in terms of health. And then also, of course, kind of practical help for citizens. So, for example, supporting people on low income to kind of move through these changes, because, of course, thinking about things right now in a cost of living crisis, food prices are top of people's mind. But also thinking about better information campaigns about how the kind of food system is impacting our health and the environment. And then also this idea of kind of visible political leadership when it comes to food. So a plan of action, a plan that has milestones and targets, and it's being put into place.
I'm wondering whether the research shows a difference between rural areas and urban communities.
Yeah, we specifically chose to do our proof of concept sites in Birmingham and in Cambridgeshire because we wanted to explore this topic in 2 different areas, one that was primarily urban and one that had a bit more rural representation, although of course there are some urban areas in Cambridgeshire. And the conversations in the 2 places were remarkably similar. So much so to the fact that we asked the facilitation organization, in your analysis, could you pull out some differences between urban and rural areas? And they actually couldn't because there was so much agreement. There was some particular differences in particular policies, but that had less to do with urban, rural, and more to do with sort of people's feeling about government intervention in general. But by and large, there was a lot of agreement And in particular, this agreement was around kind of wanting a fairer system for producers and citizens, including wanting much more support for farmers, as I mentioned. And that was consistent whether people were in an urban area or from a rural area.
You spent a lot of time talking to people for this research, but how can we ensure that people who haven't had the benefit of those conversations, particularly perhaps in more urban areas, understand the link between food and ecological security and are therefore able to make better food choices?
Yeah, we heard from citizens in the dialogues about how important they felt it was that they had learned about the food system through this process, where their food comes from and how it's impacting health and the environment and nature. And they had a strong desire for everyone in the population to kind of be able to explore food in the same way that they had gone through. So certainly that came through in the dialogues, a desire for government to take the lead in educating people, not necessarily about what to eat, not to eat, those kind of things, but about how the food system works, how food is getting onto our plates and the impact it's having, talking about the realities of the kind of impact that food is having on health, on the environment, on nature, on justice. And for that knowledge to drive everyday decisions and behaviors around food. But they were also clear that education alone wasn't the only answer. And so that sits alongside of what they were asking for in terms of government policy. It wasn't an either or, it was we have to do both.
Now, I'm interested in that because we expect the government to make legislative changes to fund initiatives, but do people really trust the government to educate them?
What we heard was that people felt that this issue was too big to put on the shoulders of citizens alone, and that they wanted kind of not just government but also food businesses to really take the hard decisions, which included, of course, having hard conversations and being truthful about impacts about the food system. So I'll read a quote that one of our food manifestos from citizens, and this is a quote from them saying that they wanted urgent action that prioritizes health and well-being over profit through government policies which shift where power is in the food system to make it fairer for farmers and others across society. So not only did they trust government, but they were expecting government to do this. And I think in many cases they were quite surprised that these policies and these kind of guardrails and protections in the system perhaps aren't already there. So there's a kind of expectation that government really does need to lead on this.
Courtney, evidence shows that people are increasingly calling for action, as you've found. And yet, when action comes, and in particular when political parties weaponize ecological issues, people then often vote against state interventions. How can we change that narrative?
As I've said, a lot of what we heard was actually about the kind of values that people want to see come through in the food system. So we heard a lot about fairness, that that people feel that the system currently isn't fair, and that the public is picking up the purse. And they didn't like that in terms of the cost to the NHS or the cost to cleaning up pollution, and the sense that kind of fairness and justice being important was coming from everyone, no matter their political background. So support for specific policies may have varied, but the ones that people nearly all agreed on was about a fairer, kind of greener, healthier system. So I think as much as we can focus on those values that unite us rather than dividing us, it's an important way to change that narrative. And this was similar with the nationwide polling that we commissioned with More in Common that also backs up that message that we are more similar than we think. And it wasn't just this group of, citizens in Cambridgeshire and Birmingham that we spoke to who felt this way. It was actually, showing up in nationwide polling as well, this kind of central tenet of fairness and of wanting a healthier, kind of greener, fairer system for was coming from everyone.
That was Dr. Courtney Scott from the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. More about this and our other headline news on our website, 8point9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.